So the talk today, it's more about giving you the tools to learn to recognize birdsong, what to look out for and listen out for in a bird's song, and information about why they're singing and what they're doing. So before I go through all of that, I just want to quickly get the formalities out of the way, tell you a little bit more about Birdwatch Ireland, who we are and what we do. This Birdwatch Ireland is the organisation I work for. We were established in 1968, and we're the largest and most active conservation organisation in Ireland. We look after wild birds and their habitats. It's not just about protecting the birds on their own. You can't do that without protecting all of the different species of plants and animal that they depend on and that we humans depend on as well for our own well-being and our own clean water and air and soil. So it's very much about biodiversity and the whole environment. So that's the only way to protect birds. We have over 15,000 members across the country. I know that several of you were kind enough to join after my talk in December. Well, at the end of this talk, I'll be giving another cheeky plug for Birdwatch Ireland membership. So I'm hoping to maybe convert or persuade some of the holdouts. We really would appreciate it. Just to say, it has been a very tough past year for Birdwatch Ireland. So we need the help. We have 30 local branches nationwide, including a very active South Dublin branch, of which I'm a committee member. And we have lots of events and activity, including in non-COVID times, a very popular annual Dawn Chorus Walk, which takes place every May. So it probably won't be able to happen this year, but hopefully things will be back to normal next year, and you can put some of these lessons into practice then. And just to say, we are a registered charity. Sometimes people think that we're perhaps a branch of the government or a semi-state body or something, but heaven forbid, no, we're an entirely independent NGO, a non-governmental organization, and we rely on the generosity of bird and nature lovers to keep us going. So it's very important for what we do. So just quickly, I want to talk to you before, I don't want to get too technical about this, but I want to tell you a little bit about birdsong, why it's so interesting and how it's produced and what it's for. And so here we see sort of a basic diagram, courtesy of some of my friends in the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. This is a diagram to show how a bird produces sound, what the organ is. So when you're listening to me talking now, you're hearing me making sound with my voice box. In a human and indeed in other mammals, that's a larynx. It's produced by a pair of vibrating cords, kind of like the strings on a guitar or a violin, which are then amplified. They vibrate a certain pitch. They then amplified by my chest cavity and by my mouth and my head and project sound outwards. For birds, it's quite a different arrangement. They don't have a larynx, they have a syrinx or a syrinx. You can see on the diagram there on the screen where it is. It's sort of at the end of the trachea, just where it joins the bronchus that then goes down into the lungs. The air sacs there as well, as you see, there's something that birds have that we don't. There's something unique to birds. And it allows them to make sound in a very interesting way because when they breathe in, some of the air is stored in air sacs and then is pumped into the lungs from there. So that means that there's always air going in and out or going over this syrinx to produce the sound. Now, the next diagram looks very technical. Don't worry, you don't have to take notes. You won't be any exams or quizzes on this. I just want to show you how complex it really quite is, but I'll show you how they make the sound. So you'll see there that the tracheal rings at the top, they're controlled by muscles, and essentially they all the tubes there, they can widen or narrow those two pipes that you see down the bottom, where there's also some membranes which vibrate with when the air pressure goes through them. Now, unlike me, when you hear my vocal cords going, that is vibrating, they're only making noise when I am breathing out. So when I'm talking to you right now, I'm breathing out all the time. And if I want to take a breath, I have to breathe in. I can't make any sound or talk when I'm doing that. It's only when it's going out. The vocal apparatus of birds is much more efficient. They can make sound whether the air is traveling in or out. It doesn't make any difference. So sometimes birds are breathing constantly when they're singing. So a bird like a skylark can sing this big long stream of notes without having to pause for breath. It sounds, but it's actually breathing the whole time. The air going in or out doesn't matter. The tubes there, in the syrinx make noise anyway. And another thing that birds can do that we can't is that they can use both of those tubes or those chambers simultaneously. They can produce two different notes at once. One side usually specializes in low notes, the other in higher notes. And that means that by producing two notes, they can harmonize with themselves, which is something we can't do. So that is another reason why birdsong sounds so rich and melodic, because there's often more than one tone in it. And then you get all these other different sympathetic tones and harmonics and all of this. It's very, very interesting. And so that's sort of, I'll give you a quick overview of it and what it's all about. I'm going to show you this first bird here. It's the same bird I started my garden bird talk with. This is the blackbird, one of our finest singers. And before I play its song for you, I want to tell you just a bit about why this bird would be singing at this time of year. So most birds really only sing in the spring and in the summer, and April and May would be the peak months for this. Some birds like the robin do sing throughout the whole year, but that's the exception rather than the rule. And the reason that birds sing, it's because, well, it's twofold reasons, really. They are defending a territory. So this male blackbird, when he is singing, he is warning all of the other males in the neighborhood, all the other male blackbirds, that this is his patch, this is his territory alone, and he's singing around the edge of that. And if they dare cross that invisible line where he's singing from, then he's putting them on notice that he will fight them, sometimes to the death. Birds are very aggressive towards each other. And what the birds are doing is they're weighing up each other's strengths and weaknesses by how strong and powerful the song of each bird is. Because the bird with the strongest song, the loudest voice, the most powerful tone, that's the bird, that's a sign to the others that he's in very good physical condition. He's not someone you'd want to take on. And so they can get a lot of their fighting done verbally by basically shouting threats and insults at each other, trying to intimidate each other. So it's a very aggressive thing that they're doing. The other thing that he's doing when he's singing is he's trying to impress the ladies. He wants to attract in a female, or in some species more than one female, and he wants to impress her with his voice because I suppose, for want of a better term, the more of his day that he can waste while singing, the clearer the sign that it's the female that he's in very good condition. He has energy to spare. It's a sign as well he's not frantically hiding from the elements. He's not scrounging around trying to find food. It's the sign he's in good physical condition, but also that territory that he's defending meets all of his food needs and then some. There's obviously surplus food there, so he is able to take care of her and any chicks they might have together. So that's a very good sign that he can do that. And also with many species, including the blackbird, the longer they live, the more melodic and varied and rich their song becomes. They learn as they go. And what that is, it's a sign to that female, that particular male has been around the block a few times. He's a few years under his belt. So it's a signal to her that he's able to look after himself, and he can prove it. So he'll be able to look after her and any chicks they would have together as well. But also, to have lived that long and survived so well, he must have good genes. So it's a sign that he will be very fit and healthy and able to look after them. But also that this female will realize that her offspring will inherit those good genes, and her sons in particular will inherit, hopefully, that strong singing ability, making it more likely that her genes will pass on for many generations. Because with the blackbird, as is the case with most bird species, it's just the male bird that sings. The female doesn't. She makes short, sharp calling notes and clucks and chirps and all of this, just like the male does to warn of danger or keep the flock together. But this very macho behavior, this territorial defense and attracting in a female, that's just something really that the males do. There are some exceptions. With the robin, both the male and the female sing. There's a strange bird in Ireland called a type of wader that breeds now up in one of Bird Return reserves in County Mayo and on the Mulla Peninsula, called the red-necked phalarope, where the situation is reversed. It's the female that does the singing and the displaying to attract the males. And then what happens in that species, she lays the eggs, of course, but then she disappears and leaves the male to incubate them and raise the chicks by himself. And she goes off and has another family further north and leaves Ireland, maybe goes up to Scotland or Iceland and has a second family there. So it's quite interesting, but that's the exception rather than the rule. With most species, it's just the male that sings. Now, if you look at this bird, there's a couple of other preliminary things I just want to tell you while I'm looking at this picture before I go into the different bird songs themselves. And I mentioned this during my garden bird talk as well. But when birds start to sing, it's actually something that's controlled by hormones. That's triggered by changes in the length of day. So that's why most of them just sing in the spring and the summer. It's after, when you get the stretch in the evenings, let's say, around when the clocks change or just before then. That's when the birds really go for it in earnest. But the dawn chorus, that lovely early morning orchestra that happens, there's a very distinct order to which the birds start to sing. And the blackbird is always one of the first birds to start singing. Whenever we do the live broadcast with Derek Mooney, it's always the first Sunday in May. I'll be giving a plug for that later as well. We do that on RT Radio 1. It's transmitted all across the world now, online and on various radio stations. But it's almost always the blackbird that starts singing first in Ireland, when we have the microphones running. And that's because the blackbird has one of the largest eyes in proportion to its head of any Irish bird. It's a member of the thrush family, and all the thrushes are similar in that respect. Because the larger the eye, the larger the retina, and the more light it will gather. Because a bird isn't happy to start singing until there's enough light for it to be able to see danger coming. Because when it's singing, it's giving away its position to every predator in the neighborhood. So every hawk, every fox, every cat can tell exactly where it is. So unless there's enough light for it to see that predator approaching, it won't sing. So that's why the birds with the largest eyes that gather the most light can sing that bit earlier in the very low light, just about dawn or just before dawn. They can sing earlier than some of the other birds can. And I'll be giving you examples of different birds today, this evening now, which sing at different times of the day. And the reverse happens in the evening. The birds with the largest eyes will sing later in the dusk chorus, which is something else that happens in the evenings. When the birds sing in the evenings, it's basically they're fixing their position. They're telling their neighbors, and this is my territory. I'm going to sleep now in a few minutes, but this is my patch and I'm here. And then in the morning, they sing again and they're telling the neighbors, I survived the night. I'm still here. This territory is not vacant. But eventually, someday, what may happen is that territory will fall silent. One of the birds will have died overnight, because most birds, when they die at night. When there's predators around, when it gets cold and dark and they can't feed, if they're anyway poorly, that's when they die. And that's a sign that silence in the morning is a sign to the neighbors that territory is now up for grabs, and they'll take it very, very quickly. So that's what's happening. Now, that's the mechanics of birdsong and the theory behind why it happens. Of course, for us humans, it's something quite different. We experience it in a different way. For us, it's very beautiful. For most species, at least. We think of birdsong something that's very calming, it connects us with nature, it's inspired poets and composers. And there are a few reasons for that. One reason is that the pitch of most birdsongs fits very well into the vocal range of human beings and of music. You know, we're tuned, hardwired to enjoy music, and birds sing in the same sort of vocal range because their ears hear more or less the same pitches that we do. So some mammals, for example, like cats and dogs, they hear at a much higher pitch than we do. Elephants and whales, they hear at a lower pitch than we do. Birds, we occupy very much the same space in terms of the frequency range that we listen to. So that's one reason why birdsong sounds so nice to us. And also because the fact they can harmonize with themselves, their voices sound very rich and very impressive. And so, and also because of the tube they have in their throat, that syrinx rather than a larynx, because there are not so many moving parts there, no vibrating strings, they have stronger voices than us. They can sing for longer without wearing out their vocal cords, because they don't have vocal cords. So that's what's happening. Anyway, I'm going to play, if this works, hopefully it will, I'm going to play the song of the blackbird for you. The blackbird is one of the best bird songs to get to grips with first. I know I'm going to be in this talk, I'm going to be bombarding with lots of information. I don't expect you to take it all in, but do try use some of these tools when you're listening to birdsong in the days and weeks to come to try and identify them or to try and work out what's happening. The blackbird has a relatively low-pitched song. It's quite slow and flowing, and it's very, very fluty. It's and it always sings a different tune. So it's almost like a jazz musician kind of improvising, but you can identify the instrument they're playing. So you can play the same tune on, let's say, a guitar or a saxophone or a violin or piano. You'd be using the same notes, but you'll be able to identify the instrument regardless of the tune. That's kind of what blackbird song is like. And what they do is they sing a sort of a relatively short, sort of fluty phrase. Then there's usually quite a long pause. The pause would be as long as the phrase they just sung, or they just sang there, or a little bit longer perhaps, and then they sing another phrase. It's kind of not in any kind of a hurry. It's kind of quite liquid, fluty kind of sound. And trying to think of them in these kind of terms certainly helps me to remember them. Different people have different tricks that work for them. We'll go through some of them during this talk, but just see what you think. Hopefully this will play for me now. You'll hear the song of the blackbird, and you can hear what I mean about being quite fluty. Long pauses between the phrases. Singing almost at random. Quite, again, fluty. Think of the flute in the orchestra. And what's happening there with it, as first at the start of the morning when the dog chorus starts, that's often the only song that you hear. And you might hear several blackbirds all around, and because it's very distinctive. Then as the birds with the higher pitched song start to join in a few minutes later, what happens is you almost tune out the blackbirds. They become the backdrop of this orchestra, sort of the bed that sort of settles everything else above them. And you can almost start to not realize they're there until you focus your ears on them again, you realize, oh, actually, yes, there's lots of blackbirds all around. And so it's well worth listening out for when you're doing that. When the blackbird starts singing, it's usually not long before its close relative, the song thrush, starts to sing. Now, the song thrush is very aptly named. It has a very accomplished song. It also has a large eye, you can see there, which means it's one of the early birds that start singing. Also, when they say the early bird catches the worm, That is quite true. You will find that birds like blackbirds and song thrushes, a lot of the times they'll have most of their singing done when some of the other birds are even just waking up, and they then will be out feeding, getting worms to feed their chicks, when birds like wrens and blue tits are just really starting up. So in some ways they leave the dawn chorus quite early on. They will keep singing throughout sporadically, but they're at their strongest right at the very, very start. Now, like all thrush species, the song thrush really is a fine singer. Its song, again, it's one worth getting to know. It's reminiscent of the blackbird that we just heard in some ways in terms of the kind of tone of it, but there's something a bit more shrill about it. It's more insistent. It sounds like it's in more of a rush, or it's something more urgent about the way that it's singing. And it's slightly higher pitched, so it cuts through above the blackbird. It's kind of like radio stations all have different frequencies, so they're not competing with each other on the airwaves. It's kind of the same with birdsong. You have the blackbird song, it's slightly lower pitched than the song thrush, it's a bit higher pitched, so they can sing side by side without competing with each other. And as far as we know, the song thrushes just care about the other song thrushes that are singing. They don't care about the song of the blackbird at all. It's almost like they tune it out. They're not competitors. They, for the territory, they're not really coming to blows or anything like that, so they ignore each other. So, song of the song thrush, it's very musical, but it's like the blackbird, quite a fluty tone to it, but shriller. And also it does another thing too. They repeat their phrases. It's something that other Irish birds don't do. So if you pick up on that repetition, that's how you will identify this bird. So what happens is they sing usually a short phrase, maybe 2, 3, or 4 notes, quite urgent and insistent and shrill. Then they will repeat that phrase. They might repeat it a second time. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. And then they move on to a new short phrase. You don't have the same sort of pauses that you do with the blackcap, or with the blackbird, sorry. The blackbird sounds like it's being more pensive, more thoughtful, putting more, I suppose, more consideration behind the phrases it sings. The song thrush seems in more of a hurry, but I'll play the song for you now. Listen for the repetition and how piercing the sound is. Pheasant in the background there. Can you hear the repetition there? Not every single time, but a lot of the time. So that's what's happening there with the song thrush. So it has that sort of shrill note and that repetition, not as fluty as the blackbird. Now I won't go back and forth too much in this talk, but I'm going to go back to the blackbird so you can hear the contrast with that song again. Lower. More pensive, more thoughtful. Bigger pauses between the phrases. Quite relaxed. Very fluty. Back to the song thrush. Repeating itself, shrill, more urgent or insistent. Okay, on to the next bird. Looks very like the previous one, doesn't it? The previous one was the song thrush. This one here is the missel thrush, a bit bigger than the song thrush. Tends to sing from quite high up. And one of the things that it's very hard to convey in a talk like this, where you're listening through your computer speakers or maybe earphones, or it's hard to convey even on the radio or on a CD or anything like that, is the three-dimensional aspect of birdsong. When you're out in a woodland or wherever listening to the dawn chorus, you're not just hearing it evenly in both ears. You're hearing some birds singing low down towards the ground, some in the mid-story, some from very high up, and you're able to pinpoint roughly where in the tree canopy or on the ground or wherever the bird happens to be singing from. The missel thrush here will usually be singing from very high up. The song thrush would be singing lower, and the blackbird could be singing low, from sort of middle down to lower towards the ground. But usually the missel thrush will be the highest. They'll often be the only bird that sings on the very stormiest days of the year. They don't mind bad weather. They'll sing in high storms, and their song as well, to me, it has a real sense of wilderness about it. It sounds wilder than the previous two. So in some ways, in terms of the tone and the structure of the song, it's like a cross between the blackbird and the song thrush. It has the sort of fluidity of the blackbird, but it has that sort of shrill, sort of, I suppose, less hesitant song of the song thrush as well. It doesn't repeat its phrases, just the song thrush does that. But the song of the mistle thrush is somewhere between the two, usually given from a high up perch. And again, it's quite wild. So think of the wild elements. This bird is, up high, often singing in a storm. So I'll play the song for you now. Listen and see what you think. The traffic singing in the back. It's not repeating like the song thrush did, but there's a similar quality to the voice. It's almost like the improvising of the blackbird. The song thrush, as though song thrush was imitating it. Lots of other birds singing in the background as well. And one of the tricks with the dawn chorus and birdsong in general is trying to filter the extraneous ones out. Now, that would be easier to do in real life because, as I said, a lot of those other birds would be singing quite low down towards the ground, whereas the mistle thrush would often be singing up high in a tree on a prominent perch, and you could quite easily focus on it. What I'd say as well is that there's only so much that listening to a lecture or even a CD or YouTube video or anything will do when it comes to birdsong. The very best way to learn birdsong is to hear a song of a bird, pinpoint it, track down the bird that's making it, watch it with your own eyes, preferably through a pair of binoculars, and watch it sing. And when you do that, it somehow makes a stronger connection in the brain for many people. That sort of locks it into your mind more rather than having to remember all these different things. Because, okay, I've only shown you 3 so far, but as I keep going, there's going to be lots more information. I know it can be overwhelming sometimes. But what I'd say is if you just get to know the most common birds, then at least when you hear something else, you'll know it's different and you'll know some of the tools and ways to describe it and things to listen for that might help you then to identify, to narrow down the candidates. So maybe you can search online and then find what the actual bird you heard is. So knowing a few basic birds really does help. What I'd say to you as well is that it's a really fun thing to do with your friends and family around you, because if you can identify birds, people act like it's witchcraft. Like it's just magic. You can tell that bird by its sound. Like anything else, it just takes practice. It's not even that difficult once you get your head around it. But most people have never tried, so it seems like a really mysterious dark art or something like that. Now, one of our key singers in Ireland is this. This is the robin. The robin is the bird that breaks the rules when it comes to singing. So as I said before, the robin, it's with this species, both the male and the female sing. So this bird in this picture could be male or female, you can't tell. Whereas mostly if you saw a bird singing, it would, even if the sexes look identical, if it's singing, it would be a male. With this species, we can't tell. Then what happens as well with the robin is they sing throughout the whole year, all year round. So if you hear a bird singing in the middle of winter, let's say November or December, there's a good chance it's going to be a robin, because the other birds, or most of the other birds at least, are silent then. And the reason for that is that most birds just keep their territory for the breeding season, so the spring and the summer essentially. Robins keep a territory all year round. So it's something that's very serious for them. And so they're singing and fighting through their songs, essentially shouting abuse at each other throughout the whole year. So there's a difference in the song, though. In the sort of spring and summer, so around now, the robin song is quite fast and jaunty. It's a very sound of spring to my ears. It really sounds quite happy and jaunty and jolly. In the colder months of the year, after, in the autumn, from the autumn onwards, what happens is that it becomes more melancholy. It slows down and sounds more wistful, but you still identify it with the same sort of tune. It reminds me a bit of the blackbird, but because this bird is smaller, the song is higher pitched and also has faster trills and runs in it. It can do the notes a bit faster. It's a song you've all heard all throughout your lives. It's a very common bird song within Ireland. Listen out, this evening if there's time after the talk, or certainly in the morning, and you will hear robin singing. I'll play the song for you now. It's a very typical Irish bird song. switches faster between the notes than the blackbird does. But like the blackbird has pauses between its phrases. And it's higher pitched because things that are smaller tend to be higher pitched. So there's more going on there than in the blackbird song. There's more notes crammed into a small space, but has a similar sort of feel to it to my ears. It is quite fluty, but higher pitched, like the piccolo maybe in an orchestra. It's and it's faster than the blackbird. It doesn't have that same sort of laid back feel. It feels a little bit more insistent, but still is taking pauses between the phrases, unlike really the song thrush or the missel thrush did. So that's what's happening there. So that's the robin. One of the birds that I would recommend most of all to get to grips with the song of, because you really will hear it everywhere. Makes a very good sort of benchmark to try and analyze the songs of other birds against, or to compare them to. This here is the wren, one of our finest singers, one of our loudest singers as well. The wren is the second smallest breeding bird in Ireland, but it has one of the loudest voices. And if one was to actually sing in a for a prolonged period in the same room as you, if it was in captivity, it would actually hurt your ears. The sound, it's well over 80 decibels, I think. It's a very, very loud little bird. So the sheer volume of this is one of the key ways to identify it. It's unlike this picture where the bird is clearly perched out in the open. Very often when wrens sing, they're tucked away in a bush, usually quite low down. So you don't often see them as well as this. But if you are lucky enough to see one in the act of singing, the whole body quivers and shakes with the effort of it. They're putting all of their energy and power into it. And the beak is wide open, really pumping out this volume. So it really is very impressive. It sings a real jumble of notes. It only lasts for a couple of seconds, but in that couple of seconds, there are a couple of hundred different notes. It's far faster than even the most virtuoso violinist could manage it. You won't be able to pick out all of the different notes in the bit I'm about to play for you, but somewhere in the long stream of twittering notes, there will usually be what I call the machine gun trill. There'll be sort of a sound in the middle of it somewhere. So I'll play the song of the wren for you and see what you think. I'm hearing a blackbird in the background there as well, and a few other things too. So you hear that it's a long string of notes. Actually, it's actually crammed into quite a short space, but it sounds like it lasts longer than it actually does because it's packing so many notes in. Very fast jumble of notes, very loud. Another clue is that this bird is usually fairly close to the ground, or somewhere between maybe shoulder and ankle height when it's singing, rarely higher than your shoulder when it's singing, because they like to be quite low down in the undergrowth. So for example, it's singing in a completely different space to what the missel thrush will be doing. It's always much lower down physically in the habitat than the missel thrush would be. Blackbirds, the song thrushes, or robins would usually be above it. Bit of an overlap with a robin maybe, but that's sort of trying to work out the levels or layers in which the birds are is important. I'll just play it for you one more time. So each phrase you're hearing there is over 200 notes. And you can hear how it cuts through over the sounds of the other birds in the background. So again, if nothing else, the sheer volume and complexity of that song is the way that you would identify it. You can't, unlike the birds we've heard so far, you can't pick out the individual notes most of the time. You couldn't hum that tune, no matter how hard you tried. There's a mechanical element to it, but also there is a musicality to it as well. This little bird, I remember talking about him in my garden bird talk, feeling a bit sorry for him because he's not so well known. This is the dunnock, the bird that was erroneously known as the hedge sparrow, because it's not a sparrow at all. It's actually far more vocally accomplished than a sparrow would be. House sparrow just basically says chirp, chirp, chirp over and over. The dunnock does more than that. However, it's not a song that you would particularly remark upon. It's quite a scratchy little song, quite unobtrusive, which fits the character of this bird. It creeps around on the ground like a little rodent, hides in the bushes, and in its physical appearance, it doesn't really draw much attention to itself either. It's kind of brown and streaky and with a bit of gray on the head and on the chest. It blends in very well. Its song helps it to blend in as well. So what I would describe this as, it's an all right song, nothing wrong with it. It does, however, over time, it gets a little bit irritating. There's a scratchiness to it, a thin sort of scratchy quality that the previous birds we've played don't have. With all the birds we've had up until now, they have kind of a musicality to them that's quite impressive. They're harmonizing with themselves. There's a richness to the tone. Not so with the Dunnock. It's kind of a thin, weedy, little scratchy song. I'm sure to a female Dunnock, it sounds absolutely gorgeous, but to the human ear, it's nothing really to write home about. And that's the secret of their success. We tend not to notice them very much, and the predators don't notice them either, but the other Dunnocks do because they're tuned into it. So I'm going to play the song of the Dunnock for you now. As I said, listen for the thin scratchiness of it, if that makes sense. Not big fluctuations in pitch either, not going too high or too low. No vocal gymnastics there. It's not hitting the high notes or going down really deep. It's sort of fairly level. No big fluctuations in volume either. It's sort of very even as it goes across like that. So that kind of scratchiness is quite a contrast to the birds we've heard previously that have this very rich tone to their voices. And that's something I like to listen out for. This is a very common bird in Ireland. They're singing a lot at the moment. I had one just singing in my garden earlier this evening, and it's one I expect to hear now in the morning. A much more common bird than people realize, very widespread within Ireland. Some bird songs tend to be fairly uninspiring or unimpressive, at least to human ears. So the Dunnock is one maybe not great. The bullfinch has a song that's very, very simple, one of the simplest of any Irish bird songs. It's also very quiet. So on the recording I'm going to play for you now, it sounds quite loud because the recording microphone is close to the bird. But actually, unless you're within a few meters of the bird, you wouldn't notice its song. It's very quiet and unobtrusive. Basically just says the same note over and over with minor variations. So the bullfinch, very beautiful to look at. You see these elaborate color patterns with the gray and the red and the black on the head. It's a really beautiful bird. The song is very simple. So just here's the song of the bullfinch. Always to me sounds like it's a little bit mournful, a little bit sad about something. Pew, pew. That's its song. Now, one of the reasons why the bullfinch doesn't need a loud song is that unlike most of our songbirds, bullfinches mate for life. And at any time of the year, you'll see the male and female together. It's actually unusual to see one by themselves. If you see the male, the female is usually just a few meters away or vice versa. And that's throughout the whole year. So he's singing, he's singing to impress the female and to strengthen that pair bond. If she's just a few feet away from him, he doesn't have to be very loud and give away his position because he knows that she can hear him. And they have the whole year to strengthen that bond as well. So that's why they can get away with such a simple song. And a lot of the time as well, the birds that tend to be the most colorful have the simplest songs, and the birds that have the drabest plumage often have the most beautiful songs. So that probably the classic example of that is a bird that I don't have in my talk tonight because we don't really have them in Ireland except as very rare visitors. That's the nightingale, probably the most famous songbird in the whole world. They are amazing vocal performers. I definitely recommend you look up some of the videos of them on YouTube. They breed in small numbers in southern England, but then in parts of the continent they're relatively common. But they're a very drab little brown bird with a slightly reddish tail. They look like someone took most of the color out of a robin. And they hide away in bushes. They don't look anything flashy at all, but their song is remarkable. And that's often the case in tropical parts of the world too. You have your very brightly colored, flashy looking birds that tend to do breeding displays, and like think of the birds of paradise in New Guinea, for example. And then you have the fine singers, which tend to be little brown, drab, streaky things that hide on the forest floor. So the bullfinch kind of follows that rule here, here in Ireland. Something interesting about the bullfinch, though, which is unlike the songs we've heard before, is that the bullfinch always sings the same song. It's always the same notes. In this case, it's a very simple one, and there's other birds where the song is more complicated, but they still have to learn. They don't improvise in a way. They always sing the same pattern of notes. So if you liken, for example, the birds we've just heard, now the blackbird being a good example, or the robin, I like to think of them as jazz musicians that are improvising, or maybe a rock guitarist improvising a guitar solo. It's different every time. They're going with the flow, whatever mood strikes them, whatever, whatever's going on around them, they're inspired by it. There are other birds that sing what we call stereotype songs. It's like in some ways musicians maybe in an orchestra following the sheet music without any variation whatsoever, because their consistency is the key, and singing or performing the music exactly as it's written. That is what's going on with them. And so you can often divide them into the stereotype songs and the sort of free singers. With the free singers that we've heard up until this bird, you have to kind of know the tone. So it's like recognizing, as I said, the difference between the tone of a violin or a guitar or a piano or a saxophone. With some of the other birds, though, you can learn the tune, and it'll always be the same, sometimes a bit sped up, sometimes slowed down, but it'll always be the same sort of tune. So a perfect example of that is this bird here. This is the chaffinch. Chaffinches are very common. There are probably more of them in Ireland than human beings. At the moment, their songs are everywhere. In some of the clips I've shown you already, or played for you already, I've heard chaffinches singing in the background of several of them. So it's a ubiquitous bird, and you're definitely hearing this at the moment. They're in fine voice at this time of the year, here, right this stage in April, and they continue to sing and get louder and more prominent through into May. Very, very common song you hear across Ireland. You've heard this multiple times throughout your lives. It's the sound of spring and summer in an Irish woodland. And the way that works is it's a descending series of notes, so going down a scale in steps. So maybe like go maybe three on one note, then down a step, another three in a lower pitch, another three in a lower pitch, more or less. Then it sort of ends in a final flourish. Sometimes that slurs up, sometimes it slurs down. And there's geographical changes depending on where you are in Europe. But it's always the same sort of pattern of notes descending down in steps with a big flourish at the end. So here's the song of the chaffinch. See if you know this one. A lot of people, when they hear this, they get the reaction of, oh yeah, I know that bird. So that's a chaffinch. Okay. Flourish. He's doing a down slur at the end rather than up slur. As soon as they'll reverse, the last two notes and go up. So you heard it's always singing the same tune there. It's a song that people in Ireland we hear all the time. So I hope that's one that you recognize. I'm just going to play it one more time for you so that you get it. Hear the blackbird in the background. So hopefully you're starting to identify those patterns in that song there. It is very distinctive. Listen out for it now tomorrow morning, or now we can all go a little bit further afield within our counties, and it's worth listening out for the next few days. See if you can track them down. Again, a very common bird, so it's a bird that you will hear anywhere there's kind of woodland or scrubby brushes, at the edge of gardens. You get this bird. Sometimes when people describe bird songs, rather than try to do a strange thing that I just did for the chaffinch song they're describing as going down in steps or whatever, people come up with a little phrase in their minds that help them to remember the flow of the song. This bird here is the yellowhammer, and it has the most famous one of all, this little device, the memory device that you have to try and remember the song. It's often written down in bird books as saying that it's saying a little bit of bread and no cheese. When you hear the song now, it doesn't sound like that at all. I can see where they're coming from. It's a way of showing that it's a very similar series of like chirps on the same sort of pitch and same sort of rhythm, and then ending in a completely different buzzing sound. So it's more like, instead of a little bit of bread and no cheese, it's more like a little bit of bread and no cheese, like this. Now that's a very bad impression of it, but that's where it's coming from. It's going da 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 da, like this. So my impressions of them are terrible. I know I'm making an idiot of myself by doing that. I'll let the yellowhammer do it itself and see what you think of this one. It's a classic stereotype song. Sometimes what happens if the yellowhammer happens to be quite distant, what you'll hear is you might just only be able to make it that final buzzing sound, that slur, and it sounds a bit like a rusty gate swinging on its hinges in the distance when you hear it. Sometimes the little bit of bread and no is faster than that. Sometimes it's slower, but it always has the same sort of rhythm to it. Very consistent, then ending in this totally different slur at the end. Now, to make that slur, that's deceptively simple. I'm going to play it for you one more time. It's not just simply a matter of making a single note. Let's play it one more time. It's actually harmonizing with itself when it's doing that. And it's sliding through a whole lot of frequencies, doing a range of a couple of octaves in a split second. It's very impressive the way that they do it. Birds don't have to think about that at all. It just comes naturally to them. But it's amazing. It's amazing how vocally complex that is. If you just see a sonogram of what's actually happening there, the amount of frequencies involved is very impressive. So that's the bird that says a little bit of bread and no cheese. This is a bird that has declined, sadly, in much of Ireland. It's very much an East Leinster bird now, in any areas where there's still tillage farming and winter stubble, which is not so much of Ireland anymore. Parts of North County Dublin, parts of Wicklow, the Birdwatch Ireland office in our car park, we have them breeding each year. And then in Wexford, they're usually the strongholds for them. Parts of Louth as well. We'll get them elsewhere, but west of the Shannon now they're pretty scarce because of their food supply. And the way we would survey these is by listening for that very distinctive song. And then you can identify where the males would be singing from, because again, it's just the males that sing. And they tend to be very reliable, very dependable at certain song purchase. So you can actually map them quite well from their songs. So that's the bird that says a little bit of bread and no cheese. Sometimes coming up with your own things to remember them can help as well. Maybe the last one didn't sound anything like a little bit of bread and no cheese to you, but if you can come up with something else that works for you, go with it. You know, it's very, very subjective. Everyone has different sort of methods of doing this. This bird here is a relative of the yellowhammer, and very different color, but they're closely related. This is called a reed bunting. It's a bird of reed beds and sort of scrubby brambles and wet field edges and that kind of thing. It's quite a common bird in Ireland, and it sings again quite a simple song. To me, it sort of sounds almost like it's saying a version of its name. It's hard to remember this one a bit, but it kind of sounds like it's going reed bunting, reed bunting. Or one of my friends, Stephen McAvoy, describes it as sounding like a roadie at a concert testing the microphone, like 1 2 check. Check 1 2. It's sort of a hesitant, very simple little song. Close related to the previous species, but the song is completely different. So here it is. So quite quiet, this recording. Reed bunting. Long pauses. Hope you can hear it. The volume is quite low on this recording. Very simple song. Some of that adds in extra notes, but still short phrases. And big pauses between them as well. Let's do that one more time. This is for the long pause. Again, the context is everything. So this bird is not going to be singing in the middle of a dense oak woodland, for example. So, you know, if you're in the local park, in most of that area, it's not going to be singing from there. If you got to a pond in that park that had reeds around it, or maybe some scrubby brambles or something, it might be in there. You know, so again, working out the habitat is very important. Birds really do stick to habitats, and especially so during the breeding season, which is when they're singing. At other times of the year, they're obviously in, you know, they could be migrating or moving around. So in the winter, it's not quite so reliable. Usually the breeding season, so now, they're most habitat faithful. So you'll find this bird in reed beds. So that's the reed bunting. And again, I know I'm bombarding you with loads of information here. The main thing is I don't expect you to remember all these songs. It's more about getting the tools to enable you to reach an identification yourselves. Now, the next two birds are species that look incredibly similar to each other. I don't know if anyone wants to hazard a guess as to what this bird is. Don't worry, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I'm just going to show you quickly. I'll have to dash through this quickly so it doesn't play the song. It's very similar to this closely related bird that looks very like it. This one here. They look extremely similar. That's one. And that's the other. They're closely related to each other. One is a willow warbler. The other is the chiffchaff. This one you're looking at on the screen now is a willow warbler. This is a migrant that comes up from sub-Saharan Africa. They have arrived in the last couple of weeks. So there's good numbers of them around Ireland. There's over 1 million pairs of these breeding in Ireland. It's a really well-kept secret. The general public do not know this bird exists, and yet when you're a bird watcher, you hear it everywhere. Really common bird. Not so much in gardens, unless you've got some big trees around. They will go into gardens, but you find them in all sorts of habitat. As the name suggests, they like willow trees a lot, but they'll go all sorts of places. There are a lot of them in woodland. Now, it is very closely related to the chiffchaff, the other bird here, this one. Very closely related. But they look extremely similar. There are slight differences in the face pattern that can be very hard to tell. There's often differences in the leg color, so that's not always consistent. The best way to tell them apart visually is by looking at the length of their wings. You can't really see this in these pictures. You can't see it at all. This bird here, the willow warbler, because it is a longer distance migrant, it migrates further than the chiffchaff does. It has longer tips to its primary feathers, like the long flight feathers, and you can see that. That's a consistent way to tell them apart. But that's hard to see. These birds don't sit still. They flit all over the place. The very best way to tell them apart is by their song. They've evolved to distinguish from each other, not visually, they look almost identical, but by their song. And the song is completely different. Here's the song of the willow warbler. To me, it's a bit like the song of the chaffinch, the finch we heard earlier, the one I showed you that was going down in steps, in that the song descends, but there's something, I suppose, a bit lazier or more relaxed about the song of the willow warbler. It kind of reminds me, just this picture that comes up in my mind, it works for me, maybe not for you. It reminds me of a leaf floating gradually down down from a tree on a still day and then just settling on the ground. It kind of starts off strong enough and then kind of runs out of steam. It sort of peters out. So here's the song of the willow warbler. Working its way down gradually and kind of running out of steam. Pausing between the phrases as well. Okay, so that's the song of the willow warbler. The next bird I show you here is the chiffchaff. Again, looks almost identical. The song could not be more different. This is the easiest bird song in Ireland. Well, one of the easiest to learn. There's another very easy one I'll show you in a few minutes. But this is one of the easiest songs to learn. The bird is named after its song. So in English, it's the chiffchaff. In Irish, it's chuffchaff. In German, it's zilpzalp. And it because the song is basically alternating two notes. Chiff, chaff, chiff, chaff, chaff. Now, it doesn't always just go chiff, chaff, chiff, chaff. Sometimes it goes chiff, chaff, chaff, chiff, chiff, chaff, 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 like this, alternating them. But it's very, very distinctive. And here it is. So it couldn't sound more different from the previous bird that looks almost identical. I just want to compare those two again very quickly. So here's the willow warbler one more time. Very unhurried, leaf fluttering down from a tree. Kind of running out of steam at the end. Whereas the chiffchaff never runs out of steam, just keeps going at the same consistent kind of volume, same sort of energy, very distinct tempo to it, almost like a metronome. You might notice in this song as well, there are pauses. It does a few chiff, chaff, chaff, chiffs out for a while. Then it sounds like it's stopping. It actually doesn't. It then stops and switches to a little quiet song where it actually goes toot, 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 toot at very low level before it starts back to chiff chaffs. Let's see if you can hear it this time. You might need headphones for it. Here. Now, one of my favorite facts about this bird is its Latin name. I always like to point this out. I don't talk too much about the Latin or the scientific names of birds, but this one is lovely. It's Philoscopus colibita. And the previous bird we saw, the willow warbler, it's also the genus Philoscopus. So that's the first part of its Latin name. And that means essentially a leaf inspector, because these birds would go around the trees looking at the underside of leaves, trying to find little insects and things to eat, caterpillars and so on. So that's what the Philoscopus, the leaf inspector, means. The colibita part of the name here, it actually comes from the Greek. It's Latinized Greek, and it's the Greek for a money lender. And that's because it was thought that the sound of this bird's song sounds like somebody rhythmically counting out coins on a table, like a moneylender would do. So you need never be stuck trying to tell the difference between a willow warbler and a chiffchaff at this time of year. Particularly, just watch for them and wait for them to sing, and then you can tell immediately. Now, onto some of our other birds. You'll recognize some of these from the Garden Bird Talk. This is the blue tit. Now, blue tits, like all members of the tit family, they are very vocal. They have a very complex language structure, really. A lot of work has been done on members of the tit family and their close relatives in the same family in North America called the chickadees. They often sing songs or have calls that are basically alternatives or variations around the phrase chickadee. So chickadee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee, like this. They've done a lot of research into this, a lot of people who are acoustic experts, and they found out that there's actually, with many of these species, there's a syntax to them, there's a grammar, they're conveying information. It is a form of language. They're able to impart information when they're doing this, which is very interesting. Obviously, we can't read that or understand that language. The main thing to realize though about the blue tit is that it has a very sort of urgent song. To me, they always sound like they're angry, like they're furious about something. They'll often sound like they're scolding you or they're giving out. Now, they're not, of course, but that's the way I like to remember it. So I'm going to play the song of the blue tit here. And this is the blue tit. And the blue tit, it's going to sound, it sounds a bit like it's a bit fussy or frustrated about something. You hear that song a lot at this time of year. There's this kind of scolding quality to it. I'll do it one more time. You can hear it has two parts to it. The sort of they alternate. It's sort of like a sharp bit at the start, and then it goes. It sort of drags out a bit more. Buzzing towards the end. Okay. This here is the great tit, another very common bird within Ireland, and one of the birds I suppose that has the most varied of voices. They sing many different types of song, and they'll often vary throughout different times of the day. They seem to be spurred on to copy their neighbors and then to try to outdo them. There's sort of a general rule among very experienced bird watchers who've been listening to birds, or bird listeners, let's say, have been listening to birds for years, that if you're in an Irish woodland and you hear a bird song that you don't know, you haven't heard before, 9 times out of 10 it'll be a great tit doing something that you've never heard them do before. They do all sorts of things. There's no hard and fast rule for this, other than to say they kind of get into a bit of a routine or a bit of a rut and tend to do the same song type for maybe a couple of minutes, and then they switch to another one. They do have one type of song, one song style that's very consistent. That's what's called their teacher song, because it sounds like they're saying the word teacher over and over. I myself, when I hear this, it sounds to me, I call it the bicycle pump song, because it sounds like somebody using a bike pump to pump up a tire. So what do you think? Just alternating 2 notes. Teacher, 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 teacher. Or think of the bike pump. Now, sometimes it'll add a third note in there. Sometimes it does buzzier things, but that's the most common great tit song that you'll hear. So that's the one to get to know. Now, when you know that song and sort of the tone of it as well, and the kind of pitch it's at, it helps you to separate it from the next bird. This is the coal tit. Coal tits are often found in the same habitat as great tits and blue tits. They can often have a scolding quality to them, like the blue tit does. They have the same sort of monotonous, repetitive quality that the great tit does. They also will sing a teacher-like song, but it's usually faster and at a higher pitch, which is what you would expect of a bird that's smaller than the great tit. Usually, the smaller the bird, the higher the song will be. Not a total rule, but it's a good rule of thumb at least. This song I'm going to play for you, they have many different variants, but this one you're going to hear how this bird and the family, as the tits are known in America, the chickadees, where that name comes from. It sounds like it's saying chickadee. Chickadee, 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 chickadee. can hear there, it's higher pitched than the great tit. So I'll go back to the great tit for a minute. And now the cold tit. Thinner. It's not quite as robust a sound. Often this bird will be singing in a conifer as well. Not always. So that's why you can tell those apart. So those three, they all have the blue tit, the great tit, and the cold tit have quite complex voices, but there are ways to tell them apart. Now here's the long-tailed tit. Despite its name, it's not actually a member of the tit family. It's from a different group of birds. And it's the first bird I want to show you where they sing sort of songs or have vocalizations that are very high-pitched. There's a few birds in Ireland that have very high-pitched songs. This is one of them. They also make these weird churring noises, and they're always in flocks doing it. So with this bird, there aren't really any differences so much between their calls and their songs. They kind of overlap. So it makes lots of mechanical noises and really high-pitched chirps and squeaks and sort of like see, see, see kind of sound. So just play a flock as the sound of a flock with them and see if you can pick out this sound. They always sound like this. Those high notes of this bird as well. So you're hearing in the background, you're hearing that churring noise they make, and you're also hearing that see, see, see. That's the sign. That's how you find long-tailed tits. You hear that sound of the trees, you know they're around somewhere, and you find them that way. Now, talking of high-pitched bird songs, this is the tree creeper, a bird that's best located by its voice. If you know the song, you can find them. They're usually high up in a tree, and they're camouflaged against the bark, so it's very hard to pick them out. They have a very high-pitched song. It's in fact extremely high-pitched. It reminds you a bit of a willow warbler, that same sort of descending series of notes, but it doesn't have sort of the lazy quality of the willow warbler song. Something more shrill about it, and certainly thinner and higher. So listen to this one here. It's going down, descending, but it's very thin and very high. Often, as I said, given from a high in a tree. So that's the sound of the tree creeper. So again, one of our highest pitched bird songs. And then on the subject of high pitched bird songs, I have to show you this next one. This has the highest pitched song of all. This is our smallest bird. This is the goldcrest. Here's a photograph of one singing, taken by a wonderful photographer called Richard Mills. The song of this bird is so high pitched that it's actually beyond the hearing range of some people. So I'm going to play the sound for you now, and some of you unfortunately may not actually be able to hear the sound. Some of you will hear it clear as day, some people will not be able to hear it, just some people naturally can't. And generally the older we get, the more we lose that high frequency hearing ability. This song is at the very edge of human ability to hear. It sounds to me like a little squeaky wheel that has an oil going round and round and round and round, and then sometimes sort of teetering off its axle. That's what it sounds like to me, at least. Usually from high in a pine tree. Sometimes people say tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle. If you can't hear that, unfortunately, yeah, that's just par for the course, I'm afraid. Very interesting little bird. Now, up until now, all the birds that I've shown you are birds that learn their songs. Most of our true songbirds, they don't innately know their songs. They have to learn them from their fathers when they're still in the nest. And that often happens very early in life. And that's one of the reasons why when a lot of birds are actually hand-reared by people, even if they survive, if they're hand-reared as from young chicks, or people even incubate eggs and rear them, that bird will never be able to cope well in the wild, and certainly won't be able to find a mate. Because if they're a male bird, they don't know which song to sing. They'll just do a garbled version of it. And if they're a female bird, they won't know what song to listen out for in a potential partner because they haven't heard their own parents sing. So there's a different group of birds, and the wood pigeon here is a prime example of that. These are birds that don't learn their songs. They're genetically hardwired into their brains. So this song is genetically coded into this bird. Every wood pigeon sounds like this. These songs tend to be simpler because they're following a genetic code. There's no improvisation on the part of the bird. There's no way of there's no need to actually learn it or improve upon it. They just do exactly as they're supposed to. The same song every time. Now, birds like pigeons and doves, they're often confused with cuckoos. So at this time of year, we get lots of reports from people, and also earlier from February on, people are contacting us in Birdwatch and saying, it's the 1st of February, I've just heard a cuckoo. Is this a record? And I always want to write back into the Irish Times or wherever it appears to say, no, but it is a mistake. Because the cuckoo couldn't be in Ireland in February, and even if it was, it wouldn't be singing. What people are hearing is they're hearing the cooing of wood pigeons and of collared doves. My general rule of thumb, which I'm going to get to in a minute, to demonstrate, if you have to ask yourself whether the bird you just heard was a cuckoo or not, then it wasn't a cuckoo. Because when you hear the real thing, as you will in a few minutes, there's no mistaking it. Even if you never heard it before in your life, you know instantly what it is. This is the song of the wood pigeon, again, genetically coded into its brain, not learned. It's a series of 5 notes. The stress is always in the same place. It goes, woo, 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 woo. So it's 5 syllables, and there's a group of 3, then a group of 2. Here's is for real. Yes, chap in the back. And that's the song of the wood pigeon. That's what they all sound like. Here's the collared dove. It has a similar sounding song in many respects, but it sings a group of 3 notes, not 5. The stress is different. So here's the song of the collared dove. So one last time, very quickly. Wood pigeon, 5 notes. Collared dove, 3 notes. So if you've never heard a cuckoo before, and this is a picture of a cuckoo here, they're very impressive looking birds, you might think, oh, maybe I've heard a cuckoo. Was that a cuckoo or not? Here's the song of the cuckoo. There is no mistaking this. It's completely different. That's what cuckoos do. So once you hear that, you know instantly you've heard the real thing. As with most birds, it's just the male that sings. And that's obviously a cuckoo would have to have its song genetically coded into its brain, because the young cuckoos in their first year of life, they never hear another cuckoo because, of course, they're not raised by their own parents. What happens is the male starts singing from sort of now onwards. He mates with the females. Once he's done that job, he's not needed anymore. He can migrate back. He doesn't have any role in rearing his chicks, so he stops singing. The female then lays her eggs in the nests of other birds. Then she disappears. She leaves them to do all the hard work. And those young cuckoos have maybe heard their foster father singing, but they've never heard another cuckoo sing. Doesn't matter. It's genetically coded in their brain to still sing that cuckoo sound. And I love the sound of this bird. Explosive nature. Carries from a long distance as well. Okay, just a couple more to show you. This is sort of interesting from a song point of view. This here is a swift, a hard bird to photograph. There's a wonderful photographer called Piotr Rak who took this picture. And it's really, he did a great job, one of the best I've ever seen of a swift. Swifts are often best identified by their sound, or picked up at least by the sound. They go high in the sky, particularly on summer evenings, and make a screaming noise. They're not in Ireland yet. They're the last of our migrants to arrive back. They usually arrive in May, and they stay with us until August. And to me, it's the real sound of summer over Dublin. This bird. But what's interesting about the screaming, it's only in the last few years ornithologists have worked out this is actually one of the very rare examples in Europe of a phenomenon that happens a lot in tropical countries, and that's where males and females duet in a performance. What you're about to hear now, it's not just one bird or just the males making the sound, it's a males calling and females responding, and that's what makes this sound. It's 2 subtly different pitches, one's the male, one's the female. And the female only makes the sound in response to a male, but she makes it almost instantly. So this is the sound of the swift, or a group of swifts. Simple as it may seem, that's a duet. Another European bird we don't have in Ireland that does a duet is the tawny owl. You know, the tuit, tuu. One's the male, one's the female. Tuit, and then tuu is a response. It's not the same bird that does them. So that's the swift, a lovely bird we'll have in Ireland again soon. Often confused with the swallow. The swallows sound, they're not even related to swifts, even though they have a similar body shape. They have a song that I absolutely love. You'll often see them perched, maybe on a stick like this, or perhaps on power lines or something like that. And their song, it's very twittery and mechanical. It always has this ratchety kind of clicking sound in the middle of it as well. It reminds you a little bit of R2-D2 from Star Wars, if you remember that. Bit of clicking. The scratchiness to it. Always listen for that clicking sound. Another really lovely bird. They're back in Ireland now in good numbers. Just to remind you, when you see your first swallow of the year or your first swift, or you hear your first cuckoo, go to springalive.net and log them there for us. We really need as many records as possible of these migrant birds. Springalive.net, it's a lot of fun, and it's a great way to learn more about migration, but also to contribute to science and give us data that helps us to save and follow the fortunes of these species as well. The Spring Alive project runs across Europe, Africa, and Central Asia. So it's a really great tool to be able to monitor migration through the BirdLife International Partnership. And the final bird I want to play for you this evening is my favorite Irish singer of all. This is a blackcap, a male blackcap. You can see aptly named with a black cap on top of his head. If it wasn't for that black on his head, he'd be fairly nondescript. He's a bit brown on the back, grey on the rest of the body, but he has a remarkable song. It usually isn't singing first thing in the dawn chorus. It usually waits maybe an hour or two before it starts singing, but it'll sing throughout the whole day. It's not a particularly early morning singer. It sings throughout the day, usually from sort of mid-level in cover, very often tucked away in an ivy-covered tree or a bush or bramble or something like that. But the song is really melodic. It has a kind of liquid quality to it, and there's real richness to it. It's very varied as well. So I'll let it speak for itself. And just the way you pick this one out is just the actual musicality of it is the best way to identify this bird. Pigeon in the back. So that's a very accomplished performer, and they can sing for hours and hours. A really nice one to listen out for, and quite a common bird in Ireland. And I've heard a lot of them over the last week near my house here in Wicklow. So that's my introduction to these bird songs. If you'd like to learn more about birdsong, I really would urge you please to tune in on RTE Radio 1 this coming Sunday, the 2nd of May, for the International Dawn Chorus Programme, which is obviously presented by Derek Mooney. I have the great privilege of being one of the co-presenters this year. We're doing it from Cuskeny Marsh down in Cork. We have special permission to go there to the Birdwatch Reserve to do it. And you'll be able to hear the birds like this chaffinch and many other species in that. And the nice thing about that programme is that it starts before dawn. So you get to hear the first birds with the large eyes, so the blackbirds, the song thrushes, the mistle thrushes, the robins, all start to sing before the chaffinches and the blue tits and the wrens and everything joins in. So that's really nice. Because of COVID, we're not able to do quite the same international element we've done before, but it is going to be a sort of pan-Celtic dawn chorus. So there's going to be contributors, hopefully from not just from here in Ireland, from all parts of the island. There's also going to be contributors from Scotland, from Wales, hopefully from Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and from Brittany as well. And it's going to be carried by the European Broadcasting Union partners, so broadcast in many countries across Europe, which is really, really great news. So it's starting from 1 a.m., not a misprint, and there's going to be some bird documentaries then as part of that, and then a few hours before dawn, I think maybe from about 4 a.m. on, we're going to start having the live bird song from across Ireland. So well worth tuning into, or at least listening back on the RT player afterwards. You'll learn a lot more about birdsong. We'll have lots of really interesting things to say about the birds, And of course, you've learned a few of the tips and tricks now, so you'll be able to pick out some of the species that you'll hear. Of course, there are hundreds more birds that you could learn to recognize the songs of, and many other birds singing in Ireland. But it's good to start with just a few, and I hope you've learned some of the tools and some of the tricks there that will help you with that. And just before we go over to any questions or anything like that, I just wanted to make a quick plea for your help with membership at Birdwatch Ireland, which I threatened / promised that I would do. So as a charity, we really do need your help. The last year has been a very tough one for us, as it has been for many charities, and we really need your support. So we're asking people, if you're interested in birds, and if you're the kind of person who's been giving up your evening to listen to me prattle on about their voices, then you're exactly the kind of person we need. And when you join Birdwatch Ireland, you get a lovely welcome pack, which is full of posters and information about our nature reserve and our events and activities. And also you get your first issue of Wings magazine in there. So this is our exclusive magazine for Birdwatch Ireland members. It comes out 4 times a year, full of information about what we're doing with the money that you entrust us with, because as a charity, we're fully accountable for what you give to us. We want you to be very proud of what you're making possible. Also, there's lots of activities there for your guards. Always a section on wildlife friendly gardening. There's competitions, there's photography sections, feeding birds, a letters page, all sorts of things. So it really is very nice. Anyone who's interested in birds would absolutely love this. Even a passing interest, you get a lot out of it and learn a lot. When you join as a family or a junior member, you also get our Bird Detectives magazine, which is aimed at primary school children, ultimately, although I know lots of adults who love it as well. It's designed for children to do things from a practical point of view, get their hands dirty, participate in surveys, do research that helps us work out what's happening with the birds. It's very important that people are learning about the birds of their own environment and their own homes. It's not all about exotic wildlife, it's about Ireland's birds. And then if you join as a family member at the moment, we're also giving you a special gift of a field guide to the common birds of Ireland. It's a really good way to get to know that every bird that you're ever likely to see in Ireland typically is in that book, including descriptions of their songs and the seasons of the year that you'll find them. And again, we're giving that free with family membership of Birdwatch Ireland. So membership runs for 12 months from when you join. So if I can persuade you to join today, it'll run till this time next year. And for individual members, it's for that 12 months, it's €50. For family members, it's €60. And again, you get the Bird Detectives magazine and the field guide with that as well. And there's a special concessionary rate for senior citizen, under 18 and students. And that's just €30 for the 12 months. You'll find all the details of that at www.birdwatchireland.ie. There's a big link there saying become a member. And also on that website, you'll find lots of information about birds. There's an online guide to Ireland's birds. There's lots of information about gardening for birds, seabirds, birds of prey, all sorts of things. So the sky is the limit when it comes to birds, quite literally. So we'd love to hear from you. There's a contact form on there. You can ask us questions or get in touch. But if you would join us as a member, it would mean the world to us. It's not just about the money. All the money we raise from that goes to support our conservation work, every cent of it. But it's not just that. The more members we have, the more clout it gives us when we're talking to politicians and decision makers. The more members we have, the more they have to listen to us, the less they can ignore us. And that's really important. So that's all I have to say for that formal part of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully if we've got time for any